I'm going to call this meeting of the Lawrence Alliance for Education to order and begin, as we always do, with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. At this time, we'll take public comment, but we have no one signed up. I want to recognize Enrique Matos from the school committee. We thank him for being here. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you. And we'll mention that the purpose of today's meeting is to discuss the Student Opportunity Act, the new funding that the state passed for districts across the state. And we'll mention that after today's meeting, there will be a second meeting on this on March 31st as well. So I think with that said, I will turn it over to the superintendent.
Thank you. So the Student Opportunity Act was passed this fall in November. And for context, the last time that the state looked at the foundation formula for schools, for districts, was back in 1993. With that came accountability measures in the form of MCAST. There were several groups and stakeholder groups that did quite a bit of lobbying and advocacy for the formula to be revisited. That included elected officials, union leaders, superintendents, parents, students. Many people worked very hard on behalf of this funding. We are the recipients of additional funding on the Student Opportunity Act. It comes with clear guidelines and additional resources. And so tonight I want to outline what those guidelines are, how they map out to the priorities in LPS, and ideas that we have for using the additional resources. So Lawrence is scheduled to receive right over $21 million this coming year, fiscal year 2021, and is also required to submit a 3-year plan. For this, we've created a process which I'm going to outline momentarily. The state gives us very clear guidelines that each district has to submit a 3-year plan, and that those plans have to be committed to doing a few things well, and that stakeholder input is received.
Superintendent, can I just ask quickly,
Sure.
Do the allotments come in a third, and a third? Is it roughly $7 million per year, or is it in a different amounts?
Yeah, great question. So the 21 is for this first year, and each additional year we will receive the complete sum of $150 million.
Great.
So here are the commitments that the Student Opportunity Act highlights in the guidelines. First, it has to be intentionally focused on student subgroups. I'm going to outline those subgroups momentarily. Second, it has to be a deepening of specific evidence-based programs. Third, it has to monitor success in reducing the disparities, again, with those subgroups. And lastly, it includes engagement with families, particularly for those subgroups. So we looked at our data in terms of the subgroups. As you can see here, we have the 3 big subgroups as students with disabilities, English learners, and then high needs, which encompasses both. These are statistics for 2 years. It is a snapshot of our subgroups. There is lots of data, but it's here to emphasize that we have a growing need with our subgroups. We continue to receive more students who are learning English for the first time, of course, students with disabilities, and in the category of high needs. The next slide is to show their achievement as a subgroup. For contrast, we've given you the all students group, and you can see the 2018 versus the 2019 achievement, followed by our students with disability, Ls and former Ls, and then again the high needs group. So what we did is we looked at all of that data in terms of our subgroups, performance, needs. We've spoken to school leaders and teachers and parents, some of it very informal, some of it has been formal gatherings with specifically principals. We devised LPS priorities. Those were brought to the board last month as a draft, and we took those 3 priorities, looked at the evidence-based program that DESE outlines, and then we drafted some possibilities of what that would look like in Lawrence. So what you'll see next is the priority, DESE's evidence-based programming, and then possibilities for that. And this is how we mapped it up again. The priorities, DESE's evidence-based programming, those are the guidelines that they've given us, and then ideas about what that would look like in LPS. So we're gonna spend the rest of our time looking at those priorities. I'm gonna ask you to look at your materials that we sent. I do have additional copies. The document is LPS Student Opportunity Plan Possibilities. I don't know if you need additional copies. Okay, do you? Okay, great. So if we can look at that. Yep, you have it right there. That's the document that we're gonna be looking at. So here's one way of looking at this. Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3 refer to the LPS priority. They are directly lifted from the budget guidelines. These are familiar to you all. Then the letters are DESE's guidelines with respect to what they would like to see us use the additional funding for. And then the numbers below that correspond to the possibilities and ideas that we have given the data and the needs that we know our community has. So I'll walk you through those. One of the things that I have done with different stakeholder groups, I encourage people to make lots of notes here so then we can have a discussion, and then you have an opportunity to give us your feedback. So in the first one, the first priority is student achievement. Broadly speaking, this refers to providing equitable standards aligned to the curriculum and instruction for all of our students. I won't read these one by one, but I'd like to summarize each one. It's important to note how we are interpreting that. In letter A, it is expanding the access to full-day, high-quality pre-K. What that would look like for LPS would be a collaboration with community partners and expanding LPS PK offering for students with significant learning needs. So the question for you all is, would you like to see additional funding, SOS funding, to support this priority, this initiative? You don't have to answer that now. That's just the question at hand. In B, it's research-based early literacy program and pre-K and early elementary grades. The examples here are creating and assembling a literacy task to develop a comprehensive plan, adopting early literacy curriculum to reflect additions supported by professional learning, and finally, expanding certification and specialized reading instruction. So the question for this one is, would you like to see additional funding for early literacy programming? In C, this is early college programs focused primarily on students for underrepresented higher education, and examples for that for us would include expanding our current early college opportunity and offering social, emotional, and cultural development supports for early college students to increase college persistency rate. This example and this is particular to our students. What we've learned from our alumni is that we do an excellent job at supporting their academics, and they're ready to enter college as freshmen. And unintended consequences of that is that they are quite shocked that because they have this additional college credits, they end up in the 300 and 400 numbers for college, which means they are now sitting with juniors and seniors, and that's quite the challenge for some of our students. An example of that is one of the alums was, while quite capable of handling 300 and 400 classes, the task at hand was writing a grant, which was quite daunting for an 18-year-old. So the question here is, would you like to see additional funding devoted to early college programming? In D, this is supporting educators to implement high-quality aligned curriculum. Examples for us include professional learning opportunities related to interventions for struggling readers, also professional development opportunities for culturally responsive and trauma-informed teaching practices, and then deepening and expanding restorative justice practices. Lastly, on priority 1, it is diversifying the educator-administrator workforce. Examples for us include expanding our current para to educator, and then getting a para to educator pathway, and then collaborating with higher education institutions to create licensure pathways for career transitions. I'll pause here for questions on any of these ideas on priority number 1.
I have a question. Is the current early college programs for all students or not, or underrepresented students who are underrepresented in higher ed? I'm confused a little bit about that.
Sure. So it is, as it states right here in C, that's the language from DESE, we have just that, and so for us it would be expanding it.
Okay.
The thing that would be new for us is number 2, which would be offering the social, emotional, and cultural identity development, and so that would require some programming around that, and the example that I gave was our students joining like seniors and juniors in college and trying to navigate that.
All right, thanks.
I guess I have a comment and then a question.
Sure.
My comment is that because of my role at the department, it's highly likely that my team will review some of the Student Opportunity Act proposals that come to the department. So I just want to state for the public record that for the purposes here, I'm going to participate fully as an LAE member, and then will recuse myself on the other side when it comes to reviewing Lawrence's SOA. So I just want to state that for the record. Maybe it's a more general question, Superintendent, to start with any of these. I look like number 1, for example. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of the questions I have right now are more around like current state, you know what I mean? Like
Sure.
Numbers and costs and what would it mean? And I guess I'm just curious how you and the team, and when you're having these conversations, like how do you factor in current numbers, current costs, and what it would mean to increase into the conversations?
Yeah, thanks for your question. Right now, we're at a pretty high level because we're trying to be sensitive to the various audiences that this presentation is intended for. It includes students, families, teachers, and so we're trying to be sensitive and make it accessible. Once we get feedback, then we can answer that question given where we land. We're going to be able to do a good analysis and be able to come back to you all with a recommendation. Here's what we know, here's where we're with this current initiative, and here's what it would take.
Other questions?
Great, so I'll move on to priority number 2, that's support services, and this is about expanding the continuum of academic, social, emotional, and mental health support, particularly again for our subgroups. In letter A, DESE's guideline is increasing personnel and services to support holistic student needs. How that translates to us, it would be designing a multidisciplinary stabilization team to address some of those needs. In this example, we envision hiring experienced mental health and behavior providers and deploying them by zones. If you remember, we rezoned our schools to provide a continuum of services, so we envision having the minimum 4 teams comprised of psychologists, social workers, BCBAs, who would be able to support kids who are experiencing any sorts of challenges. And the second example is designing a continuum for programming for newly arrived English learners, including SLIFE. We are now receiving quite a bit of middle schoolers, and we have a bit of a gap with our programming for our middle schoolers. As you know, we have 2 well-designed programs, International High School and Enlace, that capture our high schoolers, but it's not the case for the middle schoolers. And thirdly, we also propose and think about increasing the number of FTEs to address the growing needs of mental health and behavioral supports. During school planning meetings, we had a lot of requests from our schools to get additional guidance counselors, social workers, and BCBAs to support that. Next is B, which is inclusion and co-teaching for students with disabilities and English learners. And examples for Lawrence include increasing FTEs to expand the co-teaching model. Every single school that currently has a pilot of co-teaching was consistent with their request to keep that and to expand that. We are very pleased with the current outcomes of our co-teaching model. Number 2 would be providing professional learning for staff related to co-teaching best practices for our students with disabilities and our ELs. And lastly, it would be a design of continuum of programming for students with disability, of course, including inclusive practices. Lastly, on priority number 2 is the dropout prevention and recovery programs. Examples of that include implementing competency-based programming and exploring flexible programming to meet the needs of overage and undercredited students. You won't be surprised to learn that when I've met with students, this is at the top of their list, as is career readiness in college. They were very adamant about keeping that and adding additional funding. I said we would certainly include that in their feedback, and they have given us their feedback, so that's no surprise. The other thing that actually was surprising to me that when I met with students is that they were strong advocates for the pre-K experience. One girl in particular said to me, the reason I want this and I want additional funding towards that is because my baby sister got a slot, a PM slot at the Breen, and that did not work for my family. I said, I get it. So she did a really good job with her peers advocating and lobbying for pre-K. I haven't seen all of those results because they were electronic, but I'm sure that we got a lot of good feedback on that. I'll pause here and take questions on priority number 2 and any of these ideas.
Let me just check in with Pat here. Pat, are you hearing us?
I hear you now.
Okay, any questions on Roman numeral 2 on the student opportunity plan possibilities? And no is fine, you can chime in whenever you want.
Well, I've missed the first part of that, so I'll chime in a little bit.
Sorry, Pat.
I apologize, Pat. I think I probably hit the wrong button.
Okay.
Other questions on number 2?
I have the question for category number 3. It says that increase the numbers of FTEs. And you said as an example, guidance counselor. Would that include also high school counselors?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I would just say, I think I would echo Ventura's comments. All of these, it's hard to argue with any of these. And I think the question would be the assessment of readiness, like where are we, where are the gaps, how can we supplement, where do we feel like it can have the most impact. That's what I want to get a sense of. Obviously before we vote, ultimately. I mean, all of these sound like great opportunities. Thanks.
Yeah, again, I agree. I think this is initial input and feedback so that we can do an analysis and bring it back to you with good data and better sense of like, here's where we are with these particular needs.
Okay. Just another piece of that is, my hope is that that the staff will triage this too and give your hierarchy of like what's important, the way you guys see it to move the district forward. We all play educators by the side of the road and watch you guys do the work. So my hope is that you're going to have a set of, say, well, if given your choices, these are the things that you think we should support. Because I know the things that, like that kid, wanted a kindergarten for her little kid, her
Preschool, yeah.
Preschool for her kid.
Yeah.
Brother, I might just have a different opinion about something else. It may not be great online for the district.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think everything that you see here is important to us, and that is absolutely the task at hand, which is narrowing this down and being able to be thoughtful with data and some planning and analysis to bring back to you and say, here's what we've learned from our stakeholders, here's what we believe it's matched to the priorities, and here's the next step.
John,
Yep.
if I could just jump in at one point. A few years ago, the district developed a 5-year, strategic plan for inclusion. And at that time, I felt that we didn't have the funds necessary to do a good job with that plan. It was very well written, but yet we didn't have the funds for the FTEs, nor did we have enough money to really train our staff to follow that strategic plan. Is that something that the superintendent could look into, and would it fall into one of the areas that the DC is recommending that we adopt?
Want me to jump in? Yeah, absolutely. So it is on priority number 2B. If you're following along with us, Pat, you'll see that it's under inclusion and co-teaching, and that's right under what you're suggesting, which includes professional development, to your point.
Okay. I had that checked off on my form.
Great.
And I was just wondering if that would be an area that you would consider.
Yeah, so again, these are all under consideration for us, and if it were up to us, we'd like to tackle all of that. And so we're going to try to do this process which will help us narrow it down. I'm looking at myself, she's like, we don't have that much money. It's not gonna work. So that's part of the process right now.
So that would raise just the one other question in my mind that I was going to comment after we'd gone through all three, but the $21 million per year is fantastic, and we're so glad to have that, but we also need to think about year 4 and beyond, and how do the adjustments in the state funding formula project out over time. Because we don't want to do what I think all of us have seen in multiple districts, which is we make these investments and you get to the end of year 3 and suddenly they can't be sustained. And I just hope that we are thoughtful in that piece and how to maximize those investments for the long haul.
The way I have it understood is it climbs to that number and then it flattens out. It doesn't ever roll back. So, you know, I think probably people that were there when they did ed reform the first time thought, yeah, let's watch the money, they may roll it back. Who knows, they might find ways to, like, not reimburse some things to make that number go away. I hear what you're saying, but the expectation is they're gonna bring us to that number, then they're gonna steady flatten it out.
But that's going to leave us where we are right now with all the current things, which is fighting for a level funded budget every year. That would be my concern.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But the good news is that we're going to make choices this year on 21 million. Did I say that right? And next year we get to do another 21 million additive. So if we, you know, Pat, if we don't get what you want this year, maybe next year we'll get a little bit something.
Yeah, that is the good news. I'm glad you said that, because again, this is a 3-year plan. We're going to narrow it down to ensure that we are successful at implementation of some of these ideas and initiatives, and it's a 3-year idea.
Yeah.
So I'll look at priority number 3, which is engagement, and that's growing family and student engagement to build partnerships. And the language from DESE is community partnerships for in-school enrichment and wraparound services. And here are some of our examples for our context, which is expanding enrichment opportunities for all schools, expanding programs that help families navigate schools. An example of that is ELFIS. And then lastly, collaborating with community partnerships to increase skills and capacity to provide outreach to our families, in particular those students that are at risk. So again, the question here is, would you like to see additional funding allocated to this initiative and this priority? So with each one, the question is always the same. Would you like to see additional fundings allocated to the priority? And then under each priority, which one of these ideas or initiatives would you like to see move forward in the next 3 years? The next document that I have for you all, there's 2 documents that I want to walk you through, but let's see if you have any questions on priority number 3 and some of those ideas.
I think for me on priority 3, I always think of family engagement as the most important priority, but I would want to understand very clearly how the money was going to be spent, because it's easy to waste money on bad family engagement, and it's hard to create the culture and do the professional development that's needed to do high-impact family engagement, and that would be my concern. So I would love to see family engagement prioritized, but only if it's going to be done the right way. That's just my personal feeling. I suspect Jess Andrews would second me in those sentiments. Other comments or questions around?
I had the
3?
question in category Roman numeral number 3 and 2. The phrase risk students were mentioned. How can the system in the school identify the risk students? Because from my experience, I know that students who are at risk don't always speak up because they're afraid of anything like that. So how can the system identify those students?
Yeah, thank you. So under at-risk students, we think about the subgroups that we mentioned earlier. Those are also kind of rolled up in there. So students with disabilities, Ls, and then the other at-risk population that we think about is our students who have mental health challenges, behavioral challenges, trauma sensitivities. So those become our at-risk families and students that we identify. Our schools are very good at identifying who those students are and what additional supports they need.
Other comments, questions on number 3? Great.
So there's 2 other documents that I'd like to walk you through. I'm going to jump to what the stakeholder group looks like and where we are in terms of getting feedback. And that's a document that says Student Opportunity Act stakeholder groups. What we did is we looked at our calendars and think of organic meetings, gatherings that were already happened because our timeline was so short. And so as you can see, it's a pretty inclusive list. We feel confident that this is going to cover everyone from teachers, students, parents, administrators, community members, you name it. And of course, anyone else who wishes to join us in these public hearings. Any questions about this list in front of you? Okay. So now, what we have asked our stakeholder groups is to give us some feedback. And again, we've re-narrowed the field so that we are very precise in getting feedback. This can be done online. The link will be provided to you, and or you can choose to do paper and pen. I'll walk you through what this looks like. We ask all our stakeholders to identify themselves. We're really curious again about, where the largest feedback comes from. And then we've narrowed it down to say, please give us feedback on 3 evidence-based programs. That's number 2. Then we move on to the priorities as we already discussed and ask you to please give us feedback and narrow it down to up to 6 initiatives. And then the last one, we ask you to do up to 4. And finally, we ask you to choose 2. And lastly, if there are any additional things we've missed, we've forgotten, you want to add additional feedback, we welcome that as well. So in the stakeholder groups, we've had a mix of folks who like to do things electronically. They pull up their device, they click in, and they feed it. In other groups, it's been mixed. Some people say, no, I'd like to use this as paper draft and then take my time and then submit it later, which is fine. We don't have a preference. But that's what we're going to ask you all also to do. You can do it now. You can do it later. And as I said, the list will continue. When we see you all again on the 31st, we will highlight our findings with an analysis and recommendations.
Hi, I do have a question. On the evidence-based program feedback, are any of those recommendations some of the recommendations I gave by NECHI? No,
Oh,
actually,
for
it's
the
not
high school,
NEASC,
for
it's,
NEASC?
NEASC, sorry. Yeah, 'cause you guys is NEASC.
Let me, curriculum-based and PD is embedded in here more
Okay.
broadly, which was inclusive of some of the things that NEAS was specific to the high school. But we're looking at pre-K to 12, so it's a little broader than
Okay.
just the high school.
Okay.
Mayor?
I don't know which one of these I am. I know I'm not the student, but
Community partner, you can identify yourself, you can do other. I think we sort of left it pretty broadly because we could have so many other categories. So that's my recommendation, but you identify as
LAE.
you'd like.
you know, that makes sense.
John,
Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
could I ask the superintendent, please, how many of these questionnaires has she received back, or is this the first time she's introducing them?
Thanks, Pat. So up to date, we have met with, I'm just going to do the count really quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stakeholder groups. Anything between stakeholders being 20 to 3. So I don't know what that count is, but we've met with that many stakeholder groups so far.
Now, is there a plan in place to broadly distribute this, or how are you doing this?
Yeah, we welcome, every time we see a stakeholder group, we ask them and encourage them to share it with their peers. The guidelines call for a sampling of stakeholders. It's hard with a tight timeline to be able to get to everyone. We'd like to get to as many as we can, and so we're doing our best, given the timeline, to get to a varied stakeholder group.
Okay.
And did
Thank
we,
you.
did we message through the schools to the students to give students the link to do this?
So we've done that with the high schools. My experience doing this presentation with the high school, it needed a lot of interpreting. So it really does require FaceTime. We're happy to send it, but I want to make sure that people don't feel misled or misunderstanding some of these priorities. So we're really keeping it to having someone who can present it and answer questions similar to what you all have experienced right now. But we're open to doing it in a different way where people feel like they got the right information.
So we're not gonna do like just a blast at everybody do it. You want to make sure you walk people through it.
Yeah, I think, again, we're following the guidelines from DESE, which says, a sampling of stakeholders, and we thought it was important to have conversations and FaceTime with stakeholder groups.
I mean, I will say that I felt the language was a little bit tough to understand, and so that's one of the things I was going to suggest.
Yep.
But
Yep.
sitting here, having you walk me through it,
Yes.
it became easier to understand.
Yeah.
Luckily, I had tried it without the with having somebody explain it to me, and I think I'm right where I needed to be. But yeah, I was going to say, if we're going to give this to people, we have to dumb it down.
Well, we don't want to do that, and we also want to be respectful to have someone, when they have questions, that you're able to say, this is education jargon, right? We want to make it accessible as possible, but again, because our audiences are so varied, so we have teachers who are very fluent in this, administrators who are very fluent, then we have students and parents who are going to have more questions, and my framing has been a little bit different in giving them concrete examples and making it accessible in both Spanish and English, so we feel strongly that there has to be someone that is able to answer those questions.
And that's the language that DESE expects us to use.
Correct. Correct.
Because it's okay for us to be confused, but not DESE.
Well,
We wanna make
I
sure
don't want
DESE's not
anybody to be confused. I'm hoping that, I've answered your questions. I welcome any other additional questions that you have.
I do have a statement, and I don't, it's unfortunate for, our fellow board member who works for DESE, but I got to think that this is incredibly difficult for a 3-year plan on $151 million for a short period of time. So Ventura, I don't know if we can get that sent back to the mission. I don't know what they're trying to do. I think this is fraught with folly where, in the rush to make this paperwork right, things are going to get missed, and people are going to feel left out of it. It's the biggest injection of money into public education in decades, and so I'm concerned that in the rush to get it right for the bureaucracy, we're going to miss. And the superintendent's going to say, no, we're not. We're going to do the best we can not to miss. But, I think rushing in the beginning of our budget process, I think it's not a good, solid process. And I wrote that on my reflection.
I actually think you're right. I would not comment that we're going to miss. It's not possible for us to get to every stakeholder group in the short amount of time. So we're absolutely going to miss voices. I hope that we get a representation of the different stakeholder groups, but I think it is really challenging to do that with bigger and more groups given the timeline.
But, given that, like, I concur with both the mayor and the superintendent in the assessment that this is a very rushed process, but I do think it's possible to do an easier or an easy to understand survey, which may not exactly map out along the lines of the DESE priorities, but an easy to understand survey that can be available to all students and all families to fill out, that could still give significant guidance to LPS in figuring out priorities. And I would just think, why not do that and then send the message out to, all high school students. I don't know if you want to include middle school, but certainly all high school students with the link, and all families as well. That there are ways to take these options, put them in, a bit easier to understand language, just to get the general idea. And I do take your point, Superintendent. It's well taken that a lot of this requires explanation, but I think you could still get very helpful, meaningful information if it is an easier to understand and slightly different survey than one that lays out, exactly by the template DESE's given us. And that would be my concern, that you're going to end up without a good cross-section of student opinion. I know parent survey returns are always pretty low, but my sense is if it's promoted the right way in a school, you can get a lot of the students to respond, and that would be an incredibly valuable piece of information to have. Other comments and questions?
John, could I just add something?
Yep.
I hear what you're saying about a survey and a more easier survey, but if you think about what's happening right now, there's a survey, we're looking for parent feedback for the turnaround plan, we're looking for parent feedback for the Student Opportunity Act, and there's also a parent survey online for family engagement. So if you think about a parent receiving all this information at once, it could be a little bit overwhelming, because we seem to be doing everything at the same time through no fault of anybody, because this is the timeline that DC has set up for the Student Opportunity Act. If we were to survey the parents, would it be easier to combine everything in a very simple survey that would take everything that we're looking for and just do it one time and not get it over with, but get a good cross-section of what the families think?
So we went down that road with when SOA came with the coordinating committee on turnaround and earned autonomy, and I think the decision's been made to split SOA out for good reasons given the restrictive timeline. And I take your point on that, Pat. I guess I would just say I'm most interested in what the students have to say. And I think the superintendent gave us a very concrete example of what a student had to say, and something that was unexpected. And I don't, you know, I would like to see us, you know, ask for student feedback at the high school level.
Okay.
For sure, but I understand what you're saying on multiple surveys at the same time.
Okay.
I may be oversimplifying this, but the student feedback has to be the easiest one. I mean, they're basically sequestered. I mean, like, you can just walk into a classroom and have the teacher engage in that way, right? But with somebody explaining it to them. And you don't have to, I mean, I think that, I worried about a mom trying to sit down and read this at home. Like, that was my concern all by themselves. That was my big concern. But if you're gonna get their sampling through the packs, then you're gonna have time in front of them to explain it. But, you know, there are definitely classrooms at the high school that you can, you know, make sure that they do it, especially the larger classrooms, and walk kids through it. I don't see what you mean, and you have time to do that at least.
Any other comments or questions?
I'm debating not even saying this because it's going to sound like an excuse, and I apologize that it's not what I'm trying to do. But I think just to sort of put in clarification, I mean, so November 26th is when this law was signed. It is a law that, you know, all districts complete these plans by April 1st. So what we at the department had to do was come up with the forms and the guidelines to do it. What we tried to do is create, you may know there's a short form and a long form for districts who are getting over 1.5 million and then those who are getting less. So I think the recognition here from all of us, including the department, is that given the timing of the passage of the law and the legally mandated April 1st date, like, this was a sprint, you know, all along. I think that said, you know, I'd say a few things. One is that the work here, superintendent, of tapping into already existing mechanisms and structures, I think is really strong because, you know, this is something that you use these structures sort of in an ongoing basis to get feedback, and so I think that's really strong. I would support, you know, anything that we could do to expand as much as possible input as well. And then the other thing I think I would just say is that I think I've heard, be it with the high school accreditation or with the strategic plan that Pat was referencing or other things, there is room within all this process to elevate things that are not on this list, but we have evidence for here in the district where parents have participated, stakeholders have participated to identify evidence-based practices. So the degree that we're thinking of those pieces of information as well that have been created with input from other stakeholders, I think that just adds another layer of things that we might consider doing so that it doesn't feel, because I don't think what this is actually doing is, it's not the first time that the district is thinking about some of these things. It's not the first time some of these things have come up, you know, from stakeholder groups. So I do like the targeted engagement on this, and to the degree that, again, we can tap into and build on work that's already happened to really understand stakeholder priorities. I think I would just really advocate to, you know, look at those documents and that information as well.
Yeah, we have a no survey policy. Like, we've been surveyed to death. Like, there is 100% fatigue on that. And the worst part of that is not the survey process itself. It's the letting down after you do a survey. What would you like for your community to look like? And then we're like, oh, this great castle. Thank you. No castle ever appears. So people are just like, hey, we don't, stop asking us. You ain't gonna make it happen. And we had MIT come through and do this downtown thing, and they were gonna like bring out all these suggestions out, and I stopped it because either you're gonna present people what you're gonna do, or you're gonna stop talking about it, because it's frustrating for folks. And I gotta think for parents who are just thinking about their kids going through for K through 12, the work that was done even in the previous turnaround plan, that those were expectations that we gave from the heart, and that we should be, you know, which is why one of the reasons why I'm okay with the re-upping of the turnaround plan and editing that, because we have been asked, and I think it's kind of known.
I just wanted to add, in the feedback and ideas survey, I do agree that this could be simplified a little bit more, but I also agree that there should be a short, small, individual survey, because from my perspective, students, when they see a long survey, they tend to not fill it out because they don't really want to do it. But when it's short and concise and right to the point, I think it's really effective.
Thank you. Any closing questions, comments? Okay, thank you, Superintendent. I will just mention before we adjourn, our regular meeting is tomorrow night. We will have another special meeting on March 31st. I do have a couple additional comments on SOA that I'll save for tomorrow night when we have all members. And then our next regular meeting will be April 8th. So March 11th, March 31st, April 8th. This time, Chair would entertain a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. At this time, we are adjourned.